Today we're going to be learning Masechet Rosh Hashanah Daf Kavchet. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to start at the bottom of Kav Zayin and Mebet from the words Amar Rabba. Okay, we started learning about someone who blows the shofar in a bore, in a pit. So now we're going to see, Rabba says, Shama miktzat tkiya babor u miktzat tkiya sfat habor. You heard half of the tkiya in the bore and half of it out of the bore. Yatsa, you fulfill your obligation. Rashi says here on the first Rashi on the page, Kasal Kadatach, you would have thought Tahachi Kamad. At this point in the Gemara, it seems like what he means to say is, Haya omed hu b'sfat habor. I'm sitting on the edge of the bore. V'chavero tokea babor. And someone is inside the bore blowing the shofar. V'yatsa, and they go out, yatsa l'chutz, b'chatziat ki'ah. While they're blowing the shofar, not the most realistic case, they jump, they kind of climb out of the bore and they continue blowing. So I heard part of it inside, which is no good because the sound bounces off the walls and I hear an echo more. Then he comes out and I hear half the blast. So I'm yotze, because half a blast, it seems like it's enough. We'll talk about this soon. If you heard part of the blow before the sun rose, the sun began rising. This is the early time, before sunrise. It's when it's called Amud HaShachar, when the first rays of sun start appearing. Part of the tkiya was blown right before that moment. And the rest of the blast was heard after. Lo yatsa, this doesn't work. So Amar le Abaye says, Ma shnahatam. Why in the second case does it not work? Because you need a full tkiya of obligation, and you don't have that because part was done at night. Hachanami, also the first case, you should need all of the tkiya to be in the time when you're obligated, which means in a way, not just in a time, in a way that you're obligated, meaning you didn't hear it properly when it was inside. So veleka, right? This shouldn't work. So to that answers Rava Hachi Hashcha. Is that what you're comparing? Nighttime is not at all a time for shofar. But when he was blowing or she was blowing inside the bore, in the pit, whoever heard could actually fulfill their obligation. Because if they were inside, in other words, it's true, I'm outside and I can't, but I heard half of a blow by just echo, but people inside, it was actually a good shofar blow, because if anyone was inside, they could have heard, and obviously the shofar blower, him or herself. Then I heard the half outside. So since I heard half that was good and the other half was good, I just didn't hear it properly, I fulfill my obligation. That's different from a shofar blow that was done at night when you're not actually obligated. So now they question this and they say, wait a minute. L'meimra, and ultimately this will lead to us reinterpreting what Rabba said. L'meimra de Sava Rabba, does Rabba really hold Shama sof tkiya belo tkiya tkiya yatsa? Right, he said, if you hear the end and not the beginning, you fulfill your obligation. Umemela, and from there you can infer tchilat tkiya belo sof tkiya yatsa. That obviously then if you heard the end of the blow without the beginning, if you heard the beginning without the end, you would also fulfill your obligation. So now, why is that a problem? It sounds like that's what's implied from what Rava said. So the Gemara says, if so, though, we have a problem with this. Tashma, let's learn from here. Takha barishona umashach bashniya kishtayim ein biyado ela echat. Rishona is the first tkiya. In general, we do tkiya, trua tkiya, or tkiya shvarim tkiya, or whatever it might be in the middle. So is it tkiya in the beginning, tkiya at the end. The first tkiya you blew normally. The second tkiya at the end, which is also the next tkiya after that, is going to be the beginning of the next set. So that tkiya you did double. That's what it means. Mashach bashniya kishtayim. The second tkiya, the third blow of the set, was done double length. You only fulfill. You can't say we split that into two, and the first tkiya is the last one of this set, and the second part where you extend it becomes the first of the next set. We don't say that. Ramai tislakle b'tarte. Theoretically, if we say half a blow counts, then theoretically we should be able to split this one in half. Say, look, you did it extra long. Half of it belongs to one blow, half of it belongs to the next blow. Not exactly the same thing, and that's what the Gemara is going to say. But right now they think it means the same thing. And if Rabba thinks half a blow would work, then this should split into two. To which the Gemara answers no. We don't split one long sound. Just because you happen to do it long, it doesn't count as an extra blow. We know this because the shofar blowers who do longer sounds, ones who do shorter sounds. We have tkiya dola, which is much longer. We don't split it up into separate blows. But we have a second question. And because of this question, we're going to reinterpret what Rabba said. Tashma, atokea letoch habor, o letoch hadut. You you blow into a bore, a pit, or a cistern, or letoch pitas, or into a jug. Im kol shofar shama yatsa. If you heard the sound of the shofar, you're the yotze. But im kol havara shama, but if you heard the echo, lo yatsa. So now, v'amai, lipuk b'tchilat tkiya mekamid la'arbev kala. Theoretically, when the blow comes out of the shofar, before it hits the wall, the sound waves first come out into the bore. So you shouldn't say if you hear an echo, it's a problem, because theoretically, if all you need to hear is half of kol, then the first half you heard before the sound bounced against the wall, you actually heard a direct kol. Only after that, you heard an echo. So therefore, you should be yotze according to V'amai. Lipuk b'tchilat tkiya coming to the kala, right? You should be yotze from the beginning of the tkiya. If half is fine, then you should fulfill your obligation already from the beginning. Before, it should be fine. So because of that, they changed what Rabba said, and they said, okay, Kika ama Rabba b'tokeva olela nafshi. Rabba wasn't talking about I'm sitting outside the pit and someone's inside the pit and they come out. No, he's talking about I am in the pit blowing shofar and I come out while I'm in the middle of the shofar blow. So now he's talking, what Rabba's talking about is the person themselves, the shofar blower. Well, then it really doesn't make sense. If I'm inside the bore, I should be yotze the first half because I'm inside. And when I go outside, I should be yotze because I'm outside. So, and then of course it's a clear sound. So there's no new anything in this statement. So the Gemara says, no. Rabbi is saying is don't be concerned. You might be concerned that what? Let's say I'm coming out of the bore. I start blowing. Let's say my head is down when I come out. My ears come out first and the shofar's still inside. At that point, my ears are outside the pit, but my shofar's inside. And then I start hearing echoes. Then I eventually come out. This is all happening in seconds. I'm in the middle of a shofar blow, and then I hear it directly. So you might have thought that since in the middle there, I heard it through echo, maybe it wouldn't work. To which Rabbi says it does. Now, why does it work? Few options. Either because an echo in the middle doesn't matter. As long as the beginning of the blast and the end of the blast were clear, it's fine. Or we're just not concerned for that case. Like maybe you have to worry that case might happen. Comes Rabbi and he says that's such a rare instance that it's very unlikely that would happen, and therefore you don't need to be concerned for it. Okay, next halacha. Amarav Yehuda. B'shofar shel ola yitzka. Okay, before we even, let's do some background. There's a korban ola and a korban shlami. Korban ola is a korban that gets entirely sacrificed to God. That's why it's called ola. It goes up, all gets burnt to God. Nobody eats anything of it. It's in the category we call kodshe kodshim, which means it's sanctified, highest sanctity. No one's allowed to benefit from it at all. If you benefit from it, then what happens is it's called me'ila. It's misuse of consecrated property, which is usually it happens accidentally. It's accidental misuse. You would have to bring an asham me'ilot, a guilt offering, and you would have to pay back the value to the temple plus an extra fifth. Now, that's an ola. Laws of me'ila apply to an ola. Now, when laws of me'ila apply, the next thing you have to know is that if I use an item that was sanctified to the temple that has laws of me'ila applicable to it, when I use it, it stops being sanctified and turns into chulin. Okay, it's almost like a leniency about me'ila. That when there's me'ila, we're going to be more strict. We're going to be lenient to a certain extent, which is that it's not that we're trying to be lenient, but there is a leniency that comes out of it. That as soon as I misuse it, I turn it in. It automatically shifts out of sanctity into chulin. It becomes regular. It's no longer sanctified. Shlamim is very different. Shlamim is what we call kodshe kalim. It means easy, right? They're not as sanctified because the owners eat the meat. So there's never actually a law of me'ila upon them, which means because the meat gets eaten by the people. So that means you're allowed to benefit from it. Well, you're not exactly allowed to benefit from it till you slaughter the animal and take care of the sacrifice. And that's the tricky part here. You never have laws of Me'ilah. So while you shouldn't be benefiting from it, it's forbidden, but the laws of Me'ilah don't apply. Now, if the laws of Me'ilah don't apply, that means that if I use it and benefit from it, then it doesn't turn into chulin. It stays as a sanctified object because you don't have that leniency that because I used it, now it becomes regular and not sanctified. So that's going to lead to this halacha. What if you take a shofar from an animal that was designated for a korban ola or a korban shlamim and you use it? Now, using it presumably means you're getting benefit from it. We're going to question this later, but right now we're going to assume that by blowing the shofar, you're actually benefiting. So comes the Gemara, Rav Yehuda, and he says, B'shofar shel ola lo yitka. Neither of these things should be used for shofar blowing because they're part of a sanctified animal. Rashi says we're talking about when the animal's still alive. There's a bit of a debate about exactly what stage do you take the horn off the animal and use it for the shofar. It's what's the animal up to. But it was an animal that was designated for korban ola or korban shlamim. So you can't blow. And if you did, though, you fulfill your obligation because it already became chulin. It's already regular. It's not sanctified anymore. Because you misused it, it became unsanctified. B'shofar shel shlamim lo yitka. But if it's shlamim, a peace offering that the owners get to eat and there's no me'ilah, so number one, lo yitka, you still can't benefit from it. It's from a sacrifice, a sanctified animal. V'im taka lo yatsa. And if you blow on it, you blow with that shofar, you don't fulfill your obligation. Why? Because you're using a forbidden object. It never went out of hekdesh. It's still sanctified. That means you're now using sanctified property to fulfill a mitzvah. That is what we call mitzvah haba ba'avera, right? It's a mitzvah that you do while you're sinning. You can't do that. And we're going to see, this sounds a lot like lulav. We talked about mitzvah haba ba'avera if you use stolen lulav. And there were some other things in sukkah that come up here that we'll see very shortly. So my time, and what's the reason? We already explained this, but the Gemara will now explain. Ola bat me'ilah, because ola comes in the category of me'ilah, where it's forbidden to use it. And if you do, you'll be considered having been mo'el bo, okay, which is me'ilah. Kevan dima'al ba nafkala l'chulin, since you therefore used it, misused the consecrated property, it becomes chulin, and therefore you actually fulfilled your obligation by using it. Shlamim delaf b'nei me'ilah ninu, but shlamim, since they're not liable for laws of me'ilah, then isuruhu derachiv be v'lo nafke l'chulin. It has isur on it, and it doesn't become chulin, and therefore you can't fulfill your obligation at all. That was Rav Yehuda. Rava doesn't like what Rav Yehuda says. First, he's going to attack it from one perspective, and then Rava is going to say something totally different. Matkef la Rava. Emat ma'al. He says, number one, I have a problem with what you're saying. When does me'ilah kick in? When does, and it's meaning, when does something leave its status of hekdesh and go to chulin? When you used it, when you benefited. When did you benefit here? Libatar dichtaka. After you blow, that's when you hear the sound and you appreciate it. At that point, it becomes chulin. But you've already done the mitzvah, and when you were doing the mitzvah, it hadn't become chulin yet, right? There's a bit of a time problem here in terms of when things happened within time. Kikataka bisurataka. As you started blowing, you're already blowing something forbidden. It hadn't yet left its status of hekdesh until you benefited. First, you start blowing. Only after do you benefit when you hear the sound. So he doesn't like what Rav Yehuda says. The next thing he says is Ela Amarava. He says, I have another thing, which is echad ze v'echad ze lo yatsa. Neither of them really you're fulfilling your obligation. Why? Oh, so sorry, I read that wrong. Ela Amarava. So based on that, Rava says echad ze v'echad ze lo yatsa. This is the first statement of Rav. He says, therefore, no one is actually fulfilling their obligation, right? With neither one can you fulfill your obligation because both of them are still hekdesh when you blow them. But then, Hadar Amar, but then Rava changed his mind and said, echad ze v'echad ze yatsa. Actually, you can fulfill your obligation with both. And this is something I mentioned before we get back to, because mitzvot lav lehenot nitnu, this is very famous. This end, we're going to learn about mitzvot tzrichot kavanah, two very major topics in laws of mitzvot. What's the meaning of mitzvot? What's the purpose of mitzvot? What kind of intent is needed for mitzvot? These are very major topics that all come up here. They also came up in Parak Arvei Pesachim, the 10th chapter of Pesachim, if you remember. Mitzvot are not given to benefit from. It's not considered benefit that I heard the sound of the shofar. It's not like I enjoyed hearing the shofar. Even if maybe I do enjoy fulfilling a mitzvah, that's not considered hana'ah. Hana'ah is when eat something I enjoy, it tastes good. I hear beautiful music that I like, but not shofar. That's a mitzvah. I'm getting a mitzvah for this. That's not hana'ah. Mitzvot aren't meant to benefit us, not for pleasure purposes. Okay. So now, Amar Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda now gives a different halacha. That was the first halacha of Rav Yehuda. Rava disagreed. First said, I disagree with you. I think they're both can't fulfill your obligation. And then he changed his mind and said, I actually think both you can fulfill your obligation. Either which way, still disagree with Rav Yehuda. Now, Amar Rav Yehuda, b'shofar shel avodah zara lo yitka, v'im taka yatsa. Another thing he said about shofar. If you use a shofar of avodah zara, you're not allowed to. But if you did, because it was used for idol worship, of course, can't fulfill a mitzvah. But if you did, you actually fulfill your obligation because you actually blew the shofar. But b'shofar shel ir hanidachat, that's a city that all its inhabitants worshipped idols. The whole city needs to be destroyed and everything in it needs to be burned. Then lo yitka, he can't blow a shofar from that. But im taka lo yatsa, but if he did blow, it doesn't fulfill his obligation. My time, what's the reason? Ir hanidachat kitute mechatat shiur. In ir hanidachat, it's because you're supposed to burn everything. It's as if it doesn't have anything. We saw this with an etrog of Asherah and a lulav of Asherah and all the arba minim of Asherah. Come from an Asherah tree, it's something that you're supposed to burn. And since you're supposed to burn it, it's not considered of substance at all. So therefore, it's as if you blew nothing. And therefore, you wouldn't fulfill your obligation. Amar Rava. Rava continues now to talk about this idea of mitzvot lav lehenot nitnu. They weren't given to be enjoyed. So therefore, hamudar hana'ah mechavero mutar litzkalot ki'ashla mitzvah. I say, I'm not going to get any benefit from you. I may take a vow. Then you can blow shofar for me and it'll be, right, I can benefit because it's not benefit. I can get the mitzvah because the mitzvah is not benefit. So even though I said I won't get any benefit from you, I can hear the shofar that you blew. The Amar Rava furthermore said, sorry, I skipped a line. Hamudar hana'ah mishofar mutar litzkabo. If I say I'm not going to get any pleasure from the shofar, I'm also allowed to blow it because, again, it has nothing to do with pleasure. V'amar Rava, hamudar hana'ah mechavero mazeh alav mechatat b'yemot hagshamim aval lo b'yemot hachama. Now we get into trickier waters, no pun intended, or maybe yes pun intended. If you say I'm not going to benefit from someone, and then they sprinkle upon me the mechatat, the waters of the para aduma, to purify me, that's fine. However, there's a separate problem, which is if it's summer months, then I'm going to enjoy that spritz of water because I'm very hot, and therefore they can't do it. So it says here, in the rainy season, they could sprinkle on you because you're not benefiting at all. But not in the summer months. Hamudar hana'omi ma'ayan. If I say again, hamudar hana'ah from a ma'ayan, I'm not going to get any pleasure from a spring. Tovel bo tefillah shel mitzvah b'yemot hagshamim. I can go in the mikvah there in the rainy season, but aval lo b'yemot hachama, but I can't go there in the summer season because again, even though I'm doing a mitzvah, there's an added element of enjoyment that I'm getting, even though I'm not looking for that enjoyment, but I am getting enjoyment, and therefore I can't do it. And that's because I said I'm not going to get benefit because the issue is benefit. So therefore, that's what we said. They sent now to the father of Shmuel. If someone forces me to eat matzah, they shove matzah down my throat on the first night of Pesach when I'm obligated to fulfill the mitzvah. I fulfilled the mitzvah, even though I wasn't intending to eat it. They put it down my throat. I didn't even swallow it myself. It just kind of went in. So now they say, who forced me to do this? If it was an evil spirit got into me and I kind of went berserk, and because of that, I kind of ate matzah without really paying any attention to what I was doing and ate in a mad sort of way. Well, Hatanya, it says in a Braita, itim chalim, itim shoteh. Sometimes people do things clear-headed and sometimes not. Sometimes they're not clear-headed at all. In other words, normally we talk about a shoteh as a category of a person who doesn't have not of sane mind. And therefore they're not obligated to mitzvot and all that. But now we talk about one person that's has some psychological issue, or psychiatric issue, which is part of the time they're sane and part of the time they're not at all. So how does the halacha treat this person? When he's sane, so he's treated like a sane person. Kishu shoteh, but when he's not, hareu kishoteh l'chol dvarav. So if you say some crazy spirit, evil spirit got into me, I went berserk, and I wasn't clear-headed, and I just forced matzah down my throat, well, then that I'm not even obligated in a mitzvah when I'm in that state. I'm totally exempt. So that couldn't be the case. Therefore, it must be Amar Rav Ashi shekva'o Parsim. It must be Persians or some Gentile forced you to eat matzah. So Amar Rav, comes Rav, and here's the big line. Zot omeret hatokeh l'shir yatsa. That would then imply if someone forces the matzah down my throat, yotzei the mitzvah, that would mean that if somebody blows the shofar for singing purposes, just because they like the sound of the shofar, not because they're actually blowing to fulfill the mitzvah, they still fulfill the mitzvah. And which Rava says, right? So the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't that obvious? Hainu hach, aren't these the exact same thing? Of course. If you don't need intent to eat matzah, you also don't need intent to blow the shofar, right? This is the classic sugya of the mitzvot need kavanah or not. And Rava clearly says, and we'll see this inside in another minute, that mitzvot don't need intent. You can fulfill the mitzvah even without intending. So now the Gemara says, right, this is so obvious. Hainu hach, what was Rava teaching us that we didn't know? Once you say the Persians force you to eat your matzah, you fulfill your mitzvah. Obviously, then, if you're tokeh for singing purposes, you're yotzei your mitzvah, even though you didn't have intent. So ma'u detema, you might have thought to distinguish. Here's an interesting distinction they bring up. Echol matzah amar Achman v'ha'achal. Eat matzah, the Torah says, and he ate it. In other words, when someone forces me to eat matzah, they shove it down my throat. I ate that matzah. The Torah said, eat it. I ate it. Now, it's true, I didn't want to eat it, but I ate it. I did the action that was necessary. But here, this is different. Why? It doesn't say in the Torah, blow the shofar or hear the shofar blast. It doesn't say that. So here you might say zichron tru'aktiv. It says it should be a remembrance of a trua, meaning something has to happen inside you. There's a difference between a mitzvah, that's an action of a mitzvah, a maaseh mitzvah, and a kiyum mitzvah. There's a reason why you're doing this. You're doing this to have something happen to you. If you don't have any intent, then you can't have a kiyum mitzvah. How could it be a zichron truah if you were just listening to music and as if it was music? Right? You definitely don't have any zichron truah when it just sort of happened. You weren't intending it at all. Kamash malan, that it doesn't matter. Comes Rava to say that's why I gave this case of atokeh l'shir, because in fact you might have thought it's different, but it's really no different. All mitzvot don't need intent. This is fascinating, right? It means that you usually think it's important to do the mitzvah, right? And it makes you a better person while you're doing it. But it's not the doing, it's the result, the totza'ah. It's a classic distinction in Gemara learning, right? Is it the action of eating or is it having eaten? In this case, you've eaten and you've heard the shofar. It doesn't matter what you intended. It's not important. Okay, it's a good question why this is. Okay, one of the interesting commentaries is Rav Asher Weiss, who's posek today. He basically talks about, he has a very interesting attitude about this. And he says that it's because people many times do things out of habit. And therefore, it's even if you're not intending to do the mitzvah, subconsciously, it's what you want to do. And because of that, mitzvot don't need kavanah, because in other words, there's a difference maybe between negative kavanah, like I say, I don't want to fulfill the mitzvah, or just not having any intent. So he views it a little bit in that sense, that it must be you have some inherent intent. You just might not know it. That's one way of reading it. Others say, no, you really don't need intent at all. And you'll see later in the sugya, it seems to be almost of the approach that you don't really need any intent at all. And I'll show you, I'll point out where it's a bit of a weakness in Rav Asher Weiss's argument from at least a certain part of today's sugya. It doesn't mean his answer isn't a good answer. It just might mean that there's something in the sugya that raises a bit of a question. Eitive. So now we're going to ask a slew of questions, 4 questions on Rav. First question, Eitive. It says in the following source, Hayakore, Eitive is an intro word to a braita that's going to contradict something an Amora said. So we're going against Rava and we're going to read the following. You're in the middle of reading from the Sefer Torah. For whatever reason, you're reading from a Torah and you're up to Kriyat Shema in the Torah. And it happens to be the time for Kriyat Shema. Wow, perfect. If you have intent that now I'm going to switch, instead of just reading it, for the sake of reading it. I'm going to read it for the sake of fulfilling the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. You're Yotze. You fulfill your mitzvah. If not, you don't. To which the Gemara says, my lav kiven libo latzeit. Doesn't it mean im lav? If you didn't intend what? Intended to fulfill the mitzvah. That seems to indicate mitzvot need kavanah. To which the Gemara says, lo, likhot. It meant if you intend to read, then you'll fulfill your obligation. If you didn't intend to read, then not. To which the Gemara says, likhot hakakari. What do you mean likhot? You were reading. It says haya koreh b'torah. You were already reading. There's no thing about intent to read. You were reading already. So they say bekoreh lagia. It must be someone was reading to edit. He was checking the Sefer Torah proofreading. When you read like that, you're not really reading. So in kiven libo likro, it means if you had the intent, now when I go proofread this, I'm going to read it. You don't actually have to have intent to do it for the sake of the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. You just have to have intent to actually be reading. And then Rava fits in, and then we don't have a problem. Next source, Tashma. Haya over achorei beit knesset. You pass behind the shul. Oh, shaya beito samuch lebeit knesset, or you happen to live right next door to the shul. Remember once my parents rented an apartment in Jerusalem, and it was just before the Chagim, and all of the month of Elul they would hear the Sparadim with their slichot at 5 a.m. You would start to hear their chants. They were right near a shul. It's not the best location. It was a good location, but not for the sake of, not if you wanted to sleep in the mornings. So your house is right next to the shul. V'shama kol shofar or kol megillah. You're in your house and you start to hear shofar blast, or you hear someone reading the Megillah. So are you fulfill your obligation or not? So what does it say here? Im kiven libo yatsa. If you have intent, I want to fulfill my obligation, then you fulfill your obligation. If not, then not. My lav in kiven libo, let's say, doesn't it mean, what does it mean? Intend to fulfill the mitzvah. In which case, question against Rava, who said mitzvot don't need intent. This seems to say only if you intended to hear it, would you fulfill your obligation, right? Only if you intended to fulfill your obligation, would you fulfill it? So the Gemara says, lo lishmoa. No, you have to have intent to hear. You have to have intent to do the action, but not to do it for the purpose of a mitzvah. Again, this modifies mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. It means you have to have intent to do the action. If you didn't intend to do the action, it's a problem. If you intended to do the action, just didn't intend to fulfill it as a mitzvah, then it's okay. So you have to say, oh, I want to listen to that shofar. It sounds so nice, even though you didn't realize maybe today was Rosh Hashanah. So then they say, V'hashama, what do you mean? But it says he heard. So obviously you were hearing. Well, you don't have to intend to hear something. You hear something, you hear it. What's the difference whether you intended to hear it or not? So they say, so what could it mean? Savor chamor ba'almahu. Many times you hear sounds and you're not sure what they are. Maybe you just thought it was a donkey braying. Maybe you didn't realize it was a shofar. They often hear noise until you identify what it is. You don't really know what it is. You have to know it's a shofar blowing in order to fulfill your obligation. If you don't think it's a shofar, then you don't fulfill your obligation. So if you say, oh, I like the sound of that shofar, I want to hear it, that's enough to fulfill your obligation. You don't need intent for a mitzvah. So we've resolved the second source. Third source, Eitive. Nitkaven shomea v'lo nitkaven mashmiya. If I had intent to hear your shofar blast, but you didn't have intent to blow the shofar for the mitzvah, or mashmiya v'lo nitkaven shomea, or you had intent to blow the shofar for the purpose of the mitzvah, but I didn't have intent to fulfill the mitzvah. That second one is just like we just said. Lo yatsa ad shitkaven shomea umashmiya. Both of them need intent. So now, bishlama nitkaven mashmiya v'lo nitkaven shomea. We just explained that. Kas savor chamor ba'almahu. If you heard, you intended, you were blowing the shofar. I didn't. That's exactly what we said a minute ago. I at least have to have intent that I want to hear the shofar, because otherwise I could think it's just a donkey. But if I intended to fulfill my obligation and you didn't blow the shofar for the purposes of a mitzvah, what would that case be? Is that not our case of someone who's blowing for the sake to make music? And then we're basically saying you don't fulfill your obligation. And Rava had said you do fulfill your obligation if someone's tokeh al shil. So they say, Dilma kamenabech navuche. You weren't even really trying to make sounds. You were just kind of making some barking noises with your shofar, right? Like kids take the shofar around the house and they blow all sorts of weird noises. They're not really trying to blow the shofar. That's something different. You have to have at least intent to make the sound of the shofar coming out, not to blow, loud barks. So we resolved that question. Fourth question, and this one's going to take us for a while. Amar le Abai, ela me'ata hayashem bashmini b'sukkah yilkeh. He says from here, this is going to take us to the end of our daf. He says, and this is a fascinating connection, and this goes back to what I said about Rav Asher Weiss, raises a bit of a question. He says, from here, if you're going to say mitzvot need kavanah, don't need kavanah, then not only do mitzvot not need kavanah, but to transgress the prohibition of lo tosif ala mitzvot, don't add to mitzvot any. What if I add without intending to add? So for example, if I sleep in a sukkah on the 8th day of Pesach, where I'm not supposed to, because I'm only supposed to sleep in the sukkah 7 days. And if I do, it's what we call bal tosif. I'll be adding an extra day. I should get lashes for that, because even if I didn't do it for the sake of the mitzvah, just by sleeping there, mitzvot don't need kavanah. So that adding to mitzvot doesn't need kavanah. Now, if you take Rav Asher Weiss seriously, then this wouldn't be true, because Rav Asher Weiss is saying, I only inherently want to do good things. I don't want to inherently, I don't have this need to add to mitzvot. That's not something that's inherent in me. So this really wouldn't be a question according to his approach. But anyway, this is Abaya's question. So Amar lo, Rava answers and says, Shani omer, mitzvot eno over alehen ele bizmana. There's no such thing as bal tosef, according to Rava, unless it's in the time of the mitzvah. For example, I wanted to wear tefillin, and instead of 4 batim in my tefillin, I put 5. That's bal tosef. Instead of 4 minim on 4 minim on Sukkot, I take 5. That's bal tosef. But adding another day to Sukkot is not bal tosef, because it's not the time of the mitzvah, so that doesn't count. And that's his simple answer. However, Mativ Rav Shem bar Abba. Rav Shem bar Abba questions Rava and says, wait, Minayin lekohen, here's for the following braita. Minayin lekohen sholeh leduchan, a kohen goes up to do Birkat Kohanim, bless the blessing of the Kohanim. Shelo yomar, ho'il v'natat li Torah reshut levarech et Yisrael, osif bracha chamishali. You can't say, oh, the Torah gave me this, the option to bless you. I'm going to add my own blessing. Forget, I said the 3 from the Torah. I want to add my own. Kigon, like for example, the pasuk that says, Hashem Elokei avotechem, Yosef alechem, God will, it's from Tvarim, God will add onto you more bracha. Talmud Lamal, how do we know we can't do this? Lo tosifu ala davar, you can't add to anything. Yaminu small, right? You can't add anything onto the Torah. This is bal tosif. Now, here's Rav Shemon's question. Kevan dibarech le, since he already made the bracha, it says, right? Since if I oleh leduchan, he can't add another bracha. The assumption is, when is he going to add it? When he's finished. Now, once he finishes, aver zimne, he already finished the time of the mitzvah. It's no longer the time of the mitzvah. He already finished it. V'katane davar, and yet it's called bal tosif, even though the time of the mitzvah had passed. So, the Gemara is going to suggest maybe he did it in the middle before he finished. So they say V'hatanya siyem, but there's a braita where it says the exact same thing and it uses the wording and it says after he finished. So the Gemara says maybe siyem bracha achat. Maybe it meant after he finished the first bracha. Said Yivarech Hashem v'yishmerecha. Then he added his own bracha and then he continued on. And then you could still say it's the time of the mitzvah. But they don't like that because V'hatanya siyem kol berchotav. There's another braita, another version of this in a braita which says he finished all the brachot. In which case you can't say that that's what happened. So shanehacha kevan de'ilu mitchame letzibur ha'achrina hadar mevarech, and therefore kuleyom azimni. Since if more people came, he was with a group of people and he did Birkat Kohanim. What if more people showed up? He'd be able to do Birkat Kohanim again. So it's still technically the time of the mitzvah. It's not like the 8th day of Sukkot, which is no longer Sukkot anymore, and there's no mitzvah of Sukkah. That's different. And that's Rava's answer. Umenatimra. Now, where does he get this from? The kule yom azimnehu. Okay, that the whole day is the time of the mitzvah. Ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah, hanitanim b'matana achat shenit arvu b'nitanim matana achat yinatnu matana achat. So now we have this Mishnah in Zvachim, which talks about you're supposed to put the blood of the animals of the sacrifices of Bechor and Maaser, the firstborn and your 10th animal, sprinkle it in one corner of the altar. There's other sacrifices which are supposed to be sprinkled on 4 corners of the altar. So what if you have blood from one animal that mixes up with blood of another animal? So it's going to depend on what are you supposed to do? It depends on which types of sacrifices mixed with which. So if you have ones that are supposed to be placed in one corner and they got mixed up with another one that you were supposed to be placed in one corner, So you very easily, you take this. So it's true they got mixed up, but they're all supposed to be in one corner. So you put them in one corner. But matan arba. What if you have 4 mixed up with 4? One that's supposed to be on all 4 corners. Those are easy. Matan arba, but matan chat. What if 4 mixes up with 1? What are you supposed to do? Rabbi Eliezer, matan arba. You put it on all 4 corners. Rabbi Yoshua, you put them only on 1. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, but wait, you're fulfilling you're basically, instead of doing all 4, you're only doing 1 for that one korban that's supposed to be 4. You're basically over on doing less than what the mitzvah requires of you. Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua, what do you mean? I'll throw that back at you. The one that's supposed to be 1 the one that's supposed to be Bal Tosif, the one that's supposed to be 1, you're now putting on 4 corners. That's adding to the mitzvah. How could you do that? Amar le Rabbi Eliezer, lo ne'emar Bal Tosif ela kashu b'atzmo. Bal Tosif is only when it's on its own. Amar lo Rabbi Yeshua. Well, then I'll say the same for me. Lo ne'emar Bal Tigara ela kashu b'atzmo. You're telling me I'm not doing enough by only doing 1. But it's only Bal Tigara when it's by itself. I'll tell you worse. Mine is better. If I don't do 4, I just haven't done anything. That's better. That's what we call sheva al tasa. Sit and don't do anything. But but when you put it on all 4, you did something with your own hands that was forbidden. You put the one that was supposed to be 1, you put on all 4 corners now because it was all mixed up. So you did something with your own hands. That's really a problem. Now, let's look back at this case. As soon as you did 1 already for this firstborn, right? That was the blood of the 1 matana. You already fulfilled the mitzvah. The time of the mitzvah is past. And yet, katan idavar mishum bal tosif. So there you see, it's bal tosif. Lav mishum da amrinan kevan de ilu mitzrayim lebuchla achrina hadar mazemine kule yoma zimne. So what must be the reason? Because again, this is what we're trying to get to. How do you know that you could say it's different when if there's an opportunity? If you have an opportunity, if another bechor came to your hands a minute later, you'd be allowed to sprinkle that blood. That means we're still in the time of the mitzvah, even though that specific blood, the mitzvah was over, but the mitzvah of bechor still applies to you right now. You can still put blood on the altar. Therefore, that's why it's considered bal tosif. The katane davar mishum bal tosif, right? That's hadar mazimine kule yom azimne. So now, mimai dilma kasavar Rabbi Yeshua mitzvot over alehen afilu shelo bismana. Wait, did I skip something? Right. So then, maybe Rabbi Yeshua holds mitzvot. You could transgress them even shelo bismanan, and then you could say that maybe that was maybe he was saying that even when it's not. So they say, okay, let me be clear. They were trying to bring this to prove the answer that we gave of Rava, that you can distinguish between when they're still in their time of the mitzvah or not. But now they say, no, you could just simply say that maybe Rabbi Yeshua holds that a mitzvah, and we said before that Rava holds that a mitzvah has to be in its time in order for you to fulfill your obligation, in order for you to be over on Bal Tosif. And that's why, Hashem Sukkah Shmini doesn't get Malkot. Has nothing to do with mitzvot, tzrichot, kavanah, or anything. But maybe Rabbi Yeshua doesn't agree with that. And maybe that's why Rabbi Yeshua says this. Maybe he thinks Bal Tosif is even. He would say maybe on the 8th day, you would be liable for Bal Tosif. So if you intended, right? Again, that's devoid of intent. Again, where did we start? Rava said, mitzvot tzrichot kavanah, right? Mitzvot don't need intent. Came Abai and said if they don't need intent, then Bal Tosif also doesn't need intent, which means if Bal Tosif doesn't need intent, then you want to say that if someone not intending to ends up sleeping in their sukkah on the 8th day, they'd be liable, they'd get lashes. And to which Rabbi said, no, that's because it's not in its right time. And maybe Yeshua would disagree with that. Rabbi Yeshua would say it isn't its time, but maybe Rabbi Yeshua would say mitzvot need kavana, and that's why that case doesn't need that you don't get lashes. But in any case, we brought this to try to prove, but we didn't really prove anything because it could be Rabbi Yeshua doesn't hold by the same things that Rava holds by. Now comes the Gemara and says, Anan hachi chamrina. When we brought this, what we tried to say is we wanted to really raise a question on Rav Shemet. We really wanted to know. Now, you have to zoom out for a minute. Rav Shemen bar Abba brought this question of a Kohen not being able to do Birkat Kohanim extra and said, it's not the time anymore. You fulfilled the mitzvah, to which we answered, oh, he fulfilled the mitzvah, right? It was still its time. But he could have easily have brought the Mishnah in Zvachim. And in fact, better to bring the Mishnah in Zvachim because the Mishnah in Zvachim is a Mishnah. And what Rav Shemen brought was a Braita. So the question is going to be, why didn't he bring that in the first place as his question? That could have served as a question for him. So when they brought this Minat Timra, what they were really trying to say is, right, that's how they introduced this Mishnah. What they really wanted to say is, Rav Shemen bar Abba, my time is shavik manitin umotim mi Braita. Why did you leave the Mishnah aside and start questioning from a Braita? Lotiv mi manitin. You would have been much better off questioning from a Mishnah. Mishnah is a much stronger source because it got into the Mishnah. So matnitim, my time a low motive, they say to him, we understand probably why you didn't bring the Mishnah. Because if another Bechor showed up, you'd be allowed to sprinkle the blood. And therefore, Kule Yom Azimnehu. So you knew that Rava would have an answer to that. But Braita Nami, but the Braita has the same issue at stake. And therefore, Kule Yom Azimne. So they're basically asking Rav Shemen, I don't understand. You should have brought it from the Mishnah. Both have the same issue that is Bal Tosif, even though the mitzvah has passed. However, to both of them, Rava could answer that basically the mitzvah time for the mitzvah hasn't passed, and that's how we would distinguish. So Rav Shemen, why did you pick the mitzvah of the Birkat Kohanim when it was only a Braita and not the Mishnah? To which Rav Shemen bar Abba would say, Hatam lo sagi de lo yaif. If Bechor comes, if the blood of a Bechor came into your hands a minute later, you would have to do. However, if you're a Kohen and a community shows up, you don't have to bless them. You could choose to bless them, you could not choose to bless them. That's why he brought that case, because then you could say maybe it's not exactly the time of the mitzvah. So that's what we have. Rav Shemen asked this question, right? Really, Abai asked the question about the 8th day of Sukkot, sitting in the sukkah. Why is it not, do you not get lashes? If you're going to say Bal Tosi, if you're going to say mitzvah don't need intent, then Bal Tosi shouldn't need intent. To which Rava answered that it's not bismana. There is no Bal Tosif if it's not in its time. Rav Shemen asked the question. We resolved it by saying, no, that is bismana. And it's not a question. But now Rava brings a different answer. Rava Amar, let's say lo bai kavana, avor bai kavana. And this really answers the question I raised against Rav Asher Weiss, which is Rava says, you don't need intent to fulfill a mitzvah. That for sure you're going to fulfill no matter what, even without intent. But you need intent to transgress Bal Tosif. So now they ask, but wait a minute. You didn't need kavana there. You weren't trying to do Bal Tosif. You were trying to fulfill a mitzvah. So you didn't need kavana in that case. So therefore, Rava changes it a little bit. He gives, instead of 2 categories, 3 categories. He says the following. Let's say lo bai kavana. Mitzvot don't need kavana. La'avor bizmano lo bai kavana. He is going to distinguish in this answer between bizmana and lo bizmana, but a little bit differently. He says to transgress, if it's in its right time, then you can even be over on Bal Tosif. Before he seemed to say no matter what, you wouldn't be over on Bal Tosif. Here he said you will be. And so lo bizmano bai kavana. But if it's not in its time, then you would need intent. Okay, only with intent will you, if it's not in its time of a mitzvah, and that's why someone who sleeps in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeret, not intending to do Bal Tosif, not intending to do it because he wants to sleep in a sukkah for 8 days, will not get lashes because he didn't have any intent. However, if he did something bismana, it would be Bal Tosif. That will finish for today. Have a Shabbat Shalom or Shavua Tov, everyone.